The video you are about to watch is from an old woodworking magazine that I published during the years of 2003 to approximately 2006. This was a very unique magazine. It was purely video content and it was distributed on DVDs. The magazine ran for approximately 3.5 years, and then due to financial concerns, we simply had to terminate the magazine. We moved on to other things over the last roughly 15 years. However, there has been a request to resurrect this content, so I've gone through the trouble to get the equipment, the products, everything I needed in order to bring this content back to life to share with everyone. Here on this YouTube channel, we'll be putting up approximately 100 to 120 of the original stories that appeared in that magazine. The magazine was called Woodworking at Home Magazine, and it was truly one of a kind in the world. I really hope you enjoy these videos, and please tell your friends about them.
Here's the completed desk, and I'd like to point out a few of the features before we start constructing it. Now, it is a writing style desk, however you could certainly use it with a small computer like a laptop computer. The writing surface is in the form of a fold-down flap. The opening of it is controlled by these support brackets that give it a nice smooth opening motion. We've incorporated pigeonholes into the back area there. The lid is held shut with a lock. The drawers are all supported by 16-inch long full extension ball bearing slides, providing full access to the drawers as well as a nice smooth operating motion. The very bottom drawer is actually a file cabinet, a lateral file cabinet type drawer. And that gives you plenty of storage for all the bills and all the miscellaneous items that clutter up the typical household. Now at the bottom of this, we've incorporated a false bottom so that you have a hidden compartment below all of your hanging file folders. Now you may be wondering why someone would want to build a writing desk in this day and age. Well, even with the advent of computers and the internet and everything, we still have a lot of paperwork in our homes that needs to be organized, such as all of our bills and other documents associated with our lives. And this is a great place to store, organize, and place all of those important documents, as well as serve as the function of creating the financial center of your household. Now there's an awful lot of work on this project, and you'll want to start with the base, and that's where we'll take you now. The base for our desk is going to start out with a piece of 3/4 inch birch plywood. Now I've ripped it to width, cut it to length, and I took the time to make sure it's perfectly square. Now the back edge is going to be needing a 3/4 inch by 3.5 inch wide piece that will serve as the back foot area. The two sides and the front foot areas are made out of 1 inch thick maple. Now I've already ripped it to width at 3.5 inches, and now what we need to do is cut it off to length and miter the two front corners where those 2 points meet up. At the back foot area, it's going to be a basic butt joint. So let's head over to the compound miter saw and start cutting some miters. Your first trim cuts will generate this small triangular piece. Keep those because we're going to need them for glue blocks in a moment. Now with the pieces cut to their exacting length, I've gone through and put a layout mark on here. It's 1 3/4 inches up from the bottom and 2 3/16 of an inch in from the ends. And that'll show me where I want to place the radius. Now of course you're used to me using all sorts of very high-tech tools for doing layout, and I don't think one really beats this. A simple can of glue just happens to be 4 inches. And that gives me the radius that I need. For this tight of a radius, I really should be using a 3/8 inch blade. However, we'll see if we can't coax this 1/2 inch blade through the corners. The flat area should be sanded with a flat sander. The random orbit makes quick work of it. And curved surfaces like this should be done with a round sanding drum. One of the last steps before assembly is to cut all the biscuit slots and make sure everything fits up properly before we commit it to glue. And a simple layout line will help us notch away the corners to accommodate our glue blocks. And a quick dry fit to make sure everything fits up proper before committing it to glue. Not wanting to hurry, I'm using liquid hide glue for my adhesive. It has a much longer open time, and that gives me the time to go through and make sure everything fits up nice so I don't feel rushed. And a couple of band clamps should hold everything together. Along the front corners of our base, we need to cut a 1 5/8 inch radius. Now this is one of the reasons why we wanted to make sure that that biscuit that we installed here to reinforce the joint was further back. Otherwise we could expose an edge of it either on the front or the side. Now you could sand away this material using a belt sander, but we're going to attempt it over at the bandsaw. A few moments with the random orbit sander and we'll have that curve nice and smooth. Well, that should do the trick. What I'm doing is getting ready now to glue up the panels that will make up the top, the shelf, and the 2 side panels. The glue up procedure is the same for all 4 components. Now I'm not going to be using any biscuits. I'll just be applying glue, clamp it up, and then we'll go ahead and sand everything flat after that. What I like to do when I'm gluing up panels is move the surfaces up and down until they're flush with each other. And then I'll apply the full clamping pressure. And we'll throw a few clamps on here to hold everything together good and tight, and then we can move on after the glue sets up. With the panel glue ups all sanded flat, at this point we can go ahead and trim them up to size. Now remember, if you don't have a sliding table, you can always put a straight edge on there and cut it with your circular saw. I'm getting ready now to machine the sliding dovetail sockets. I've installed a 1/2 inch diameter dovetailing bit in my handheld router, and this is my fixed base one, and that helps prevent me from wanting to lift it up in the middle of a cut, which you can't do with dovetailing bits. Now I've measured from the edge of my router to the center line so I know how far to offset my clamp-on tool guide. Now I'll just take the 4 cuts, 2 on each side panel, and then we can move on. As you can see, this sample piece that I've cut the male portion of the dovetail on slides nicely in my dovetail slots. I don't want to have to hammer it in or even force it in. I want it to be able to slide freely through there. Now if your stock isn't flat to begin with, you could have troubles there. So make sure when you do your panel glue-ups, you start with good flat timbers. With the setup piece all done now, we can move on to machining our dovetail onto the end pieces of our shelves. To do that, I've installed my 1/2 inch dovetail bit in my router table, and this is the same one I had in my handheld router. I've raised it up 3/8 of an inch and set that dimension very carefully. It may be just a tad shy of the actual depth of the dovetail socket. Now I have to take a series of test cuts on a scrap block, adjusting the fence back and forth until I get my sample piece to fit into the dovetail sockets nicely. Over here at the router table, I've installed a 3/4 inch diameter straight cutting router bit. Now I've raised it up 3/8 of an inch and exposed 1/4 of an inch of it from the fence. And that'll allow us to machine the rabbet that goes along the inside back edge of our side panels. To provide mobility for our drawers, we're going to be using ball bearing slides. Now I'm not a big fan of directly screwing the slide to our inside panel because it is natural wood. It's going to expand and contract with changes in humidity. So we have to accommodate that. To do that, we're going to be attaching our slide to a cleat, and it's a T-shaped cleat. And we're going to also be using some clamps to help hold that cleat down tight against the inside faces of our sides. Now the first step, we of course have to rip our stock to width, cut it off to length, and plane it to thickness. Now we do need to machine this rabbet on here, so we'll show you that setup over at the router table. To machine those rabbets on the sides of our cleats, I've installed a 3/4 inch router bit, and I've raised it up 5/8 of an inch and exposed 1/4 of an inch of it away from the fence. Now the 1/4 inch dimension is very critical, so take your time to get that dimension just right. Now we have to allow this cleat to move independently of the side of our desk. Now up near the front edge, we will be directly affixing that to our desk side. But near the back, we need to allow it to float because the side is going to, of course, grow and shrink. So at the back end, we'll be using these little clamps, but we won't be attaching the cleat to the desk side. Only the clamp will be holding that in place. Now there are a number of clamps, but they're all made the same way, and we just simply rip them to width, cut them off to length. Now the length is very critical because we do want to use the length of this clamp to establish the vertical positioning of each of our cleats. So take your time to get that cut just perfect. Then it's just a matter of creating a little rabbet that allows it to come over the lip on the bottom of our cleat and hold it in place. To machine that little rabbet on the end of our clamps, I've installed my 1/2-inch stacked dado head cutter, and I've raised it up 3/8 of an inch. Passed my miter gauge with an auxiliary fence over it, which created a cutout. Then from there I established a stop block that sets my 1/4 inch rabbet length. I'm moving on now to the face frame components of our desk. Now I do want to make sure that all the rails and stiles are the exact same length. That just makes sure that the case comes up nice and square during assembly. Now one of the tricks I've learned over the years is before ripping the boards into their individual pieces, if you can cut them off all at the same time, they're all going to be the same length. The two components that make up the stiles of the face frame need to have a series of mortises machined in them. I've already gone through, laid out their locations. Now near the bottom end, we're going to have a sort of a bridle joint at that end. Now the two rails near the top that separate our two narrow drawers, those two will also need to have a mortise machined in them, and that's in the exact center. Now to machine the mortises, I've set up the hollow chisel mortiser. While there are several different methods and ways of machining these mortises, right now we're going to be using the hollow chisel mortiser. It is one of the most efficient tools for machining a square hole into a workpiece. Now I've got a 1/2-inch chisel in here. I've got all of my positions set for my fence, my depth stop and so forth, and now we're ready to start machining. And you may need to take a few moments to clean up your mortises with a chisel. Now with our mortises machined, we need to cut the tenons on the ends of each of our rails. Now to cut the tenons in this application, what I'm going to be using is my 3/4 inch stacked dado head cutter. Now on the edge cuts, we need to be an 1/8 inch high on the saw blade. Now my stop is set at 3/4 of an inch over. And that of course is fixed throughout all 4 face machining operations. Now when we go to do the face cuts, I'll have to raise the saw blade up to 1/4 inch to cut the 2 faces. Now I have checked to make sure that my miter gauge is perfectly square to the saw blade and that my stop block here is also cut off nice and square. Near the top of our rails, it terminates with a 6-inch radius. Now as you can see, I'm using another one of my high-tech layout tools to give me that radius. And it only takes a minute here at the bandsaw to cut out the curve. Now I won't refine the shape until after assembly. At that point I can be sure to blend in that radius with the side panel. Well, and now at this point we can assemble the 2 sides and the 2 shelves, and everything's a dry assembly at this point. But we've got a very critical and difficult step coming up. Now again, I've got my face frame here all dry assembled, and what we have to do is let in the face frame into that top shelf. Now as you can see here, it stands proud of our side, and this face frame is going to be attached directly to that side piece. So we have to cut away that material on the front of the shelf. Now truthfully, there's no easy way to do this one. It's going to take time, care, and attention. Now I mentioned before when we cut this material away here that we didn't want to go quite to the line because we want this to blend in flush with this surface. Now where this radius comes down, I want it to come right to a point where it would intersect with the bottom of our top shelf. So I need to make a mark right there. With that oscillating spindle sander, I was able to blend that radius down and get my intersection point there. Now what I want to do is transfer that curve onto the front of our shelf. Now again, I didn't sand up in this area because I'll blend that in after assembly when we get these two pieces together. With our desk now laying on its back on a flat surface, I placed a 3/4 inch piece of stock underneath my shelf. We will be having a piece of material come in behind that later on. Now the two sides are laying flat on top of my work surface, and what that allows me to do is place a square on here, resting on the front edge of the side. I can pencil in a line that represents how deep down I need to cut away material. And here you can see the area of material that we need to remove. And as you would suspect, this will be the tricky part, this curved area right in here. Well, we've got that one area that's a straight cut. So I've raised my saw blade up to the shallow height, not the full height, and then I've carefully lined up that mark with my saw blade. Now we can make our first cut. A little bit of hand saw work, some filing and sanding, and we should have this detail done. Well, as you can see, I'm getting closer. I've been at it for about a half hour now and got it pretty well roughed in. I know that when I clamp across here and draw the sides in, my stiles are pulled down from the top edge of the case. So I know I've got some more work to go yet, but I'll take my time and work with finer and finer tools as I get closer and closer on that fit. With some filing and sanding and so forth, I've got it right up to the pencil line and it's mating up good. Now we can move on to the next step. Now further down on the desk, we also need to bring this shelf forward 1/4 inch. And that's so that our door can meet up with it and everything remains flush at the front. So we'll need to fit this area in the same way we did up at near the top shelf. However, it's not quite as fussy because it's for the most part very well concealed. So we'll mark those locations and trim those down using a similar procedure. Moving on to our fold-down door, my original plan was to use this piece of curly maple for the field panel. However, the other day Dick Singh was over and he was nosing around in my lumber pile and was eyeing up this piece of material. So I figured I better use it up now before he gets his paws on it. So this will be my field panel, and these will be the stiles and rails that'll make up the framework for that panel. Now I've already gone through, ripped my stiles to width, rails to width, sized up my field panel. Now what we need to do is machine a dado along the inside edges of each of the stiles and rails. And that dado will be 1/4 inch wide, 1/4 inch in from each face, and 1/2 inch deep from the edge. We'll do that over at the table saw. With a 1/4 inch stacked dado head cutter in the table saw raised up 1/2 inch and my rip fence set at 1/4 inch, we're all ready to make those dado cuts. I've also installed a feather board to help keep my board tight against the fence while I'm making the cut. Now we need to create a tongue all the way around our field panel to fit inside the dado that we machined on the stiles and rails. Now, maple has a tendency to split out when using a router. But a router would also give me a nice surface finish on the faces of that tongue. And I don't want the split out. So what I'm going to do is I've installed my standard saw blade and raised it up just a little bit less than 1/8 inch. Then I set the distance from this side of the blade to the fence at 9/16. Now what I'll do is I'll make a face groove around the perimeter on both faces of the field panel. Then we can go over to the router and cut away the rest of the material. Now on the outside face, you want it to be 1/8 inch deep. On the inside face, you want that tongue to be a 1/4 inch deep, and then that should give you your 1/4 inch thickness on the tongue. Now I've set my router bit up, currently at 1/8 of an inch, and exposed 9/16 of it away from the fence. Now I'll go through and sand a small chamfer on that edge detail that we just created, and then we can miter up our frame and put it together. Well, one last thing I want to tend to before I assemble my door frame components is to machine out the area for our lock set. Now this lock is what's going to be used to hold our door shut. Now laying out for a lock is a little bit tedious, and you do want to take your time with it. Now the only real critical dimension that we have to start with is positioning our keyhole at the center line of that upper rail. And then from there it's just a matter of transferring all the dimensions back onto the edge of our rail. Now what we need to do is start roughing out most of the material to make clearance for the lock set itself. Over here at the drill press, I've installed a 21/64 inch drill bit, and that should remove most of the material we need for clearance. I've also set up a fence on my drill press table to help support and guide the workpiece so I can drill a series of adjacent holes. And now it's time to square up that opening using some good sharp chisels. Take your time. It's a bit of a finicky process. Now what we need to do is drill the holes for our mounting screws. On the back side of the selvage, you'll notice that there's a large burr or a raised area. We need to provide clearance for that when we're also drilling the holes for our mounting screws. First we'll drill with a 1/16 inch drill bit for the pilot hole of the screws, and then we'll use a 5/16 inch drill bit to drill in just a little bit to create a counterbore clearance area for the back of the selvage. Now with the lock plate pushed in, I wanted to show you one more important aspect. This surface over here, this is the front or the outside of the door. This is the inside of the door. Notice where the bolt is. It's further back from center. We do want that bolt to be in further from the front. Now what I'm going to do is take this sharp utility knife and scribe a line all the way around the selvage, and then we can mortise that in. After taking a series of chopping cuts all along the surface, what I'm trying to do is just chop down roughly or approximately to a depth that's equal to the thickness of the selvage. Now what we need to do is take and pare out that material. Being very, very careful not to break the boundary of our score line. By placing the lock set in upside down, you can get a rough idea of how you need to go. Well, I've got it fitting in there real nice now. It's almost perfectly flush, but I don't want to whittle away any more material until my final fit. Now our next step is to create the keyhole. Again, follow your layout and the location relative to the lock set. Transfer the whole location down onto the front, drill it out. Now remember, your keyhole should be vertical to start with. I started out by boring a hole with a 13/64 inch drill bit, which is slightly larger than the barrel portion of the key. Now I'll place the key over that location, trace around, and now we need to cut away this material. A 9/64 inch drill bit made pretty quick work of getting most of that material out of the way. Now I'll just finish it up with a sharp utility knife. Now keep in mind that there will be an escutcheon that goes over this, but you still don't want to have a goobered up hole there. Take your time, make it look decent. And as you're sizing your keyhole, make sure that you can actually operate the lock as well. Now I got a little bit of binding there, so I got a little more cleanup to do. As you can see, I'm getting ready now to do the layout and installation of our strike plate. Now, of course, it has to be lined up perfectly with our lock set. So I'm going to take my time, very carefully lay out its position, and then we'll go ahead and inlet that strike plate the same way we did with the lock set. Now, the last thing I want to do before gluing up my door panel is to bore the holes for the fall flap hinges. Now, these hinges are very fascinating in how they operate, but the cool part is their installation is very easy. All we need to do is bore a couple of 35mm holes into the door and the shelf. Now I'll be locating my hinges 4 inches in from each end, and it requires us to drill that hole 13mm in from each edge. Now that 13mm works out to about 1/2 inch, and 35mm works out to 1 3/8 inches. So you can use those dimensions to bore the holes. Now be careful on how deep you bore, because if you go too deep, you're going to see the back side of the hinge on the front side of your door. Here you can see I've got a fence clamped on, and that's exactly the 13mm away from the edge of the board. And of course I've got my depth stop set appropriately, and it's just a matter of carefully drilling in. And that should do it for the hinges. Now we can go ahead and assemble our door frame. To help reinforce this miter joint, which is a very weak joint, I'll be using biscuits. I'll cut the slots and then we can glue everything up. And now we're ready to assemble the door. Now you'll notice on the rabbited area of the field panel, I've already gone through and stained that to the darker color, because I won't be able to get to that after assembly. Now it's just glue, biscuits, and clamps. Now to help keep that field panel centered, I'm going to be using these little space balls. They're just little rubber balls. We'll place 3 along the long rails, 2 on the short rails. Now remember, don't glue the field panel in place. And we'll throw a band clamp on there to pull the joints together and let the glue dry. As you may have guessed by now, assembly of this desk is going to be in a series of stages. It's a rather complex assembly, so we have to take it step by step. Now I'll be starting out with the face frame. That just simply gets glued together and clamped up until the glue takes hold. If you'll be staining it, be careful with the glue. You don't want to squeeze out on any of the surfaces that'll be exposed. Now I have gone through and sanded up the inside surfaces of each of the rails and so forth, and that way I don't have to deal with it after assembly. Then we can clamp it up and check it for square. The face frame is going to join to the side panels using number 20 biscuits. Now I've already, as you can see, gone through, laid out their locations, and cut the slots. The only critical element that you want to pay attention to is that you want to have them set back from the outside face more than normal. In fact, I'm about 1/2 inch back. Now what that's going to do is give us extra clearance along that front corner when we round it over later on. Well, as you can see, I've gone through one more dry assembly before committing everything to glue. Everything's fitting up good. I'm going to look it over real careful, then we'll glue it up. Now we're ready to assemble the sides and face frame together. Now we only need glue, some biscuits, and clamps. And now we can start clamping everything up. Well, that used up just about every clamp in my arsenal. We'll let this sit for a little while, then we can move on. With the case pretty much assembled at this point, we can start attending to some of the small details of the desk. Now, one of the things that we need to do is add this 3/8 by 3/4 inch wide strip behind the door, and that acts as a door stop. It just gets held in place with some brads and glue. Now we can go about installing our drawer support system, and that will start out here at the bottom edge. We'll put our first clamp in place, bring it up flush with the bottom edge of the desk, and tack it in place with a couple of brads. We can glue our one bearing mounting cleat up near the front edge. The back end we want to float. So I'll put a little dab of glue there. Slide that under. Put glue on our next clamp. And I'll just keep repeating this all the way around. Now with the desk upside down on my workbench, I've got access to the area where our center divider is for our 2 upper drawers, as well as the bottom surface of our shelf. Now we're going to need to fill this little gap back here. It's really not noticeable from the front of the desk, but we should fill it. A piece of 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch maple will do the trick. Next, we're going to need to provide a place to mount up our drawer slides, so we need a piece of 1-inch maple, and that will go right behind our center divider. Now, of course, we'll be fixing this component directly to these front rails, but again, we've got a cross-grain situation, so we're going to need a slip joint at the back end. And that's a very simple system of just a matter of gluing together a few pieces of wood that create these square openings. And then inside that square opening, we'll insert a smaller square piece of stock that's screwed and fastened to the bottom surface of our shelf. Now we'll get started by drilling the pocket holes and fastening in our center support. The Craig pocket hole jig makes it very easy to drill the pocket holes. We'll use some glue and screws to hold our slip joint bracket to our center drawer divider. As you can see, I've already put in the filler strip, and as I mentioned, that's just glue and some brads. Now we can slide in our center divider. I've got a clamp on here to make sure that I keep it all centered up nice. And we can tighten up the pocket hole screws, one on each side. To fasten down our guide blocks and to hold down our slip joint bracket, I'm using number 10 by 1.5 long sheet metal screws. I've got a number 10 washer and then a 3/16 inch fender washer. And as you can see, that clamps down over the entire surface, yet allowing it to move fore and aft. And a quick check to make sure everything's centered up properly. Then using a screwdriver, I'll just get the screws started. That'll create a mark where I know I need to drill for the screw. Be careful not to drill all the way through. Now I'm ready to start rounding over this front edge. Now it's actually a B detail because it's got that little ledge on each face. This is what it's going to look like. Now I've gone through and set up and done some test cuts on some of my sample maple. Now what I wanted to do is make sure that I wasn't going to get any split out or tear out while I'm making these cuts, because at this point it's going to be very difficult to correct if I get that problem. And I found that it was cutting very nicely. Now if I was getting some split out, what I'd do is take shallower cuts and just keep working my profile down until I get to the final depth. Now in retrospect, it probably would have been easier to do this beading bit on these stiles over at the router table before assembly. Now I've switched over to a 1/2 inch radius beading bit, and I'll zip around on the top surface of our base. Now we can turn our attention to the crest rail. As you can see, I've already cut it to width and to length and laid out where we need the radius to be machined at the top. But our first step is to machine the rabbet along the front face that allows it to come forward to bump up with the back edge of the top. That rabbet needs to be a 1/2 inch deep into the board and 3/8 in from the end. I've installed a 1/2 inch stacked dado head cutter to machine this. I've raised it up a 1/2 inch, and I've set a stop block on my miter gauge that will control the 3/8 width of cut. Now we need to cut out that decorative bead detail at the top corners. You could use a bandsaw or a scroll saw, whichever is more convenient for you. And after some detail and finish sanding, we can now install the crest rail. Primarily it's held in place with glue. However, if it's a little bit loose fitting, there's no problem with driving a few brads in through the back side. I've gone through and done all the detail sanding that I can at this point. And I've taken my desk frame and set it on top of the base, centered it up carefully. Now we want the front position of the frame to be consistent or to remain in the same position relative to the front of the base. So what we're going to be doing to attach these is drilling through this rail and installing some number 8 by 1.5 wood screws. Near the back of the case, we have our cross grain situation, so we're going to be using another slip joint made up of the same simple blocks that we did on the other one. Now in this case, we'll be gluing our bracket to our inside rail that's supporting our drawer guide. So we'll just apply a little bit of glue there, making sure not to get any down on this surface because we do need this bracket to slide back and forth. Now I do have to be careful how far back I position it so that our back panel has clearance to come in. Now I'll clamp this in place, and after the glue's had a chance to set up, I'll use my block of wood, my fender washer, number 8 washer, and a number 8 by 1.5 inch long sheet metal screw, and then tighten that down against our plywood base. On the back side of our front rails, we need to install these 1 inch by 1 inch filler blocks. And what they're going to do is give us a means of mounting our bracket that holds the fall down flap in position. They simply get glued in place. Moving on to the pigeonhole portion of our desk now, I've already gone through, ripped my material to width, cut it off to length, and planed it to thickness. Now of course don't start out with 3/4 inch material and plane it down to a 1/4 inch thickness. Pick up some 3/8 inch material or even 1/4 inch material. If needed, glue up your panels to get the 8 inch width. Now we need to machine a series of rabbets and dados. We'll be doing all that machining here at the table saw with the miter gauge with the stop block. Now I've got a 1/4 inch stacked dado head cutter in the table saw and I've raised it up 1/16 of an inch. Now it's just a matter of making the cuts and adjusting the stopover. Now at this point you have to make a couple of decisions. How you're going to finish it and if you want to finish it before assembly. The assembly portion is going to go relatively slow because you've got all these little parts that have to line up and you can't really do it all at once. So you have to construct it in stages. So I'll be starting with the 2 F components, the A and the B components, and I'll get those glued up, clamped up together, and then we'll just take it step by step throughout the rest of the process. Now there's just basically glue holding all these joints together, and that's the traditional way of doing it. If you have a pin nailer, you may want to use that to help reinforce these joints. Now I'll join the bottom piece C with the 2 vertical pieces E in our previous assembly. And of course, make sure you get the orientation of all your dados in the right direction. And as you can see, I'm on my last segment right now. The assembly's been going pretty good, just taking my time, gluing the pieces in place, and clamping it up. And now we can bring in the other end piece. And I think that's enough clamps. We'll let this sit in the clamps for about an hour or so, detail sand it, and then we're done with the pigeonholes. All of the material for our drawers is 1/2 inch thick maple. You could also use poplar or whatever species is economical in your area. Now I've already gone through, planed it down to a 1/2 inch thick, ripped my boards to their width and cut them off to length. Now I'm going to be going through the process of cutting the dovetail joints that will join the fronts to the 2 side pieces. Now I've already set up my dovetailing jig on top of my drawer side. Now I'll go ahead and start cutting those dovetails. It took all of about 10 minutes or so to cut the dovetails on the drawer side pieces. Now we move on to the drawer fronts. I've switched templates and switched router bits. Now I'm ready to cut the pins. Now with all the dovetail machining done and out of the way, we can turn our attention to cutting the grooves that will hold the plywood bottoms. Now on the 3 upper drawers, there's only 1 groove. On the bottom drawer, the file cabinet drawer, we're actually going to be creating 2 grooves. One will be for the false bottom and one will be for the real bottom. Now I've already got my 1/4 inch stacked dado head cutter set up in the table saw, raised it up 1/4 inch, and set my rib fence for the first grooving operation. I've just added a 1/4 inch chipper to my stacked dado head cutter, so I've got a 1/2 inch width. The height stays at 1/4 inch. And what I want to do is machine the grooves in the sides of the drawer that will receive the backs of the drawer. And we need the side of the drawer to extend beyond where we want that back panel to be by 1/2 of an inch. So I'll set a stop and then we can make all those cuts. As you can see, I'm assembling one of the drawers, and this is the bottom drawer, the most complex of them, because it has that false bottom in it. Now I'll start out by applying glue to each of the dovetails and pins. Now I'll connect the side and the front pieces. Now for the real bottom. Now I'll get some glue in that lower dado area. We'll put in our short back section. Don't get too fussy about this yet because we got to spread these apart and get the tall back section in. And now we can drop in our false bottom. And now we can put in the tall back, making sure that I don't get any glue on our false bottom, because that of course needs to slide out to gain access to that little compartment. Now I'll check it for square. It's a little off, so I'm just pushing in on the long diagonal. And there we have it. Now what I'll do is I'll just tack this bottom panel in place with some 1/2 inch long brads. And we'll tack the back panels in place with a couple more brads. And that nearly completes the file cabinet drawer. I'm going to let the glue set up before moving on to the next step, which is to attach a couple of aluminum cleats that the file folders can hang on. After ripping each of the drawer fronts to their proper width and cutting them to length, it was just a matter of passing them over a 1/2 inch radius roundover bit that was raised up slightly higher than my table surface. And that gives me about a 1/16 inch reveal all the way around and creates a nice classical look. Now we're going to need some little hooks to hold up these hanging folders. Now you can buy this plastic material and use that on the edges of the drawers to hold up the folders. However, I really don't like these myself. I prefer to use this extruded aluminum material. It's 1/8 inch thick, 1 inch wide, and you can pick it up at most home center and hardware stores. And I just cut it off to length to fit inside the box. Now I'll drill and counterbore some holes so that we can fasten it to the drawer side with number 6 by 1/2 inch wood screws. With the workpiece securely clamped to the drill press table, using a 5/64 inch drill bit, I can drill the clearance holes. Now I've switched to a single flute countersink to countersink the holes so that the screws tighten up flush. We want the aluminum strip to be a 1/4 inch higher than the edge of the drawer. So hold it up against the edge of the drawer, mark your hole locations, pre-drill the holes with a 1/16 inch drill bit, and then drive the screws home. Earlier on in this project, we had hinted that we were going to be coloring this project a much darker color than the very white maple that it currently is. Now, the process that we're going to use to color this is applying a water-soluble aniline dye. And because it's a water-based product, we know that if we add water to the wood, it's going to raise the grain. So our first step, after all of our finished sanding with 220 grit paper, was to wet down the project, let it dry overnight, and that raised the grain. Then we sanded it out with 400 grit sandpaper, and that took away all that fuzziness. Now you can apply this water-soluble dye using brushes, rags, pads, or a number of different techniques. As you're seeing here, we're spraying it on. It's a good opportunity to learn about a new tool, in this case our HVLP spray gun. It helps us to see how the spray patterns work out and coverage and so forth. So spraying on dyes or stains is a very easy way to learn how to work with a new spray gun. Now because we add so much moisture to the wood with both the pre-wetting and sanding as well as spraying on that water-soluble dye, we do want to check our moisture content before putting on our oil top coats. I do want to make sure that the moisture content comes right back down to where it was just prior to starting the finishing operation. Now for my first top coat, I'm going to be applying a tung oil. Now as you can see, the project is more on the reddish color range right now, and that might be affected by the light colored background here in the scene. By adding this tung oil, it's going to bring it more to a browner color and add depth as well as highlight the grain in the wood. Even this soft maple that's very white and plain, the tung oil will bring out that grain pattern and help emphasize it a little bit and add character to the overall project. Now I'm just wiping it on nice and heavy, get a good heavy wet coat on there, and then let it soak in for a couple minutes, and then I'll wipe off the excess with a dry rag, making sure that I wipe it down very evenly. And you will notice that the coloring will come back off on the rags, and that is normal. Don't be surprised by that. For the top coat, I'm applying oil and urethane top coat product with a satin finish. Now I apply this using a cut-up t-shirt or a small cotton pad, and I just simply wipe it on. Now I'm going to be applying about 4, possibly even as much as 5 coats of this. In between coats, I sand lightly with 400 grit sandpaper. Just before my final coat, the last sanding will be a 600 grit sandpaper and a light buffing with 4/0 steel wool, and then I can apply my final coat. To apply the finish, I just simply wet the surface, not getting it so heavy that there could be runs, but I get the whole surface that I'm working on wet. Then I take the same wet rag that I've applied the finish with, and then take long, even strokes with the grain to smooth out the finish. Our first step in final assembly is to get the drawers installed. Now I've taken and drawn a center line down the edge of each of my drawers, transferred the hole locations by holding the slide flush up against the front of the drawer, transfer the hole locations. Now we can mount our slides to the drawers. Now I'm going about installing the slides into the cabinet, and even though I've got my center lines on here, I find it very handy to cut off a couple of sticks to rest the slide on while I make the marks for the hole locations. And they of course are cut both to the same length, and it makes the process go pretty easy. Well, I think we better add some false fronts. It's looking pretty ugly at this point. Installing our false fronts is a relatively easy process. Now it starts out either working from the top down or the bottom up. In this case, I work from the bottom going up. Now the first gap or distance between the false front and the bottom of the case is 7/8 of an inch. So using 2 shims on top of the base, I can position my first false front. Get that one in place, and then from that point going up, it's a 3/4 inch gap between each of the drawers. So I've got some 3/4 inch shims, of which I'll place on top of the drawer below it. Now you'll notice that I've got some tape on the back of the false front, and that's carpet tape. It's very thin and it has a great tack to it. Now what I'll do is I'll bring the front down on top of those 2 shims. Using another block of wood, I'll bring the false front over flush with the drawer below it, and then push it in. Now if your drawer front's recessed into the cabinet a little bit, you may have to reach behind and push the drawer box out to make contact. Now using a drill bit with a stop collar attached to it, I can drill from inside the box into our drawer front. And of course I want to be very careful not to drill through. And we can attach the front using 3/4 inch long screws. Now I'm using sheet metal screws in this application. There are also another type of screw that has a larger flange washer built into it that works very well too. You'll only need 2 screws on the top 2 drawers, and then you should use 4 screws for each of the false fronts on the bottom drawers. Now we're going to be needing to add some pulls to the drawer fronts. Now I've selected this little handled affair. It comes in 2 different sizes. This will be the small one for the small drawer, and then a larger unit for the larger drawers. Now we have to, of course, find the center of our drawer left to right and top to bottom. And from left to right, it's 6.5 inches, and that will be our offset from the left and right edges of each of the remaining drawers going down. Now once we find our center line, we need to come over 1/2 inch on either side because we have 1 inch hole spacing, and we can drill through with a 7/32 inch drill bit. And as almost always the case, you're probably going to need longer machine screws. Now the size that they'll provide is 832 by 3/4, and you'll most probably need 832 by 1 inch. To help with pulling out the false bottom, I've glued on a piece of canvas. And I've sanded up the edges nicely so that it slides in nice but stays in place. Now I've gone through and installed my strike plate. Now we can turn our attention to the supports for the fall flap. To position the support on the desk itself, I'm going to follow the manufacturer's recommendations for where to position it vertically. However, because we have an inset door, I'll be extending mine in further back from that 37mm dimension they give you. Rather, I'll be using 1 13/16 for my setback. On one of the two supports, you'll have to remove the bracket that mounts to the fall flap and reverse its position. Now we can install the hinge components in both the desk and in the fall flap. And now we can go ahead and install the lock set, tightening that up real good. The escutcheon gets held in place with a couple of small brads. Now more often than not they're too long, so you may have to cut them off with the side cutters. Then just very carefully tap them into place. With the work support adjusted to the same height as my desk surface, we can now bring in our fall flap and get that tightened up in position. With the fall flap now parallel with our desk surface, I brought down the bracket, positioned my foot so that it's about a ½ inch in from the edge, and marked the hole locations. Now we can just simply drill the holes, being very careful not to drill through to the front side. And that works wonderfully. As you can see, my pigeonhole assembly, I left the natural color, and I just finished it with the wipe-on oil and urethane product. And that was no fun task reaching inside each of these cubbies. But I figure a nice way to frame it out is to wrap this black felt around the assembly before I slide it into the case. And that'll provide a nice black line right around the front edge. And this might explain why we've waited till this point to put on the back panel. The standard procedure to hold in a back panel is to tack it in place with staples or brads. However, in this case, should we ever need to perform any maintenance on our pigeonhole assembly, the only way to get it out is through the back. So screws make the most sense to hold the back panel in place. And as with the pigeonhole assembly, I left the back panel just with a plain finish. Well, that wraps up this project. There's a very special lady in my family that's going to get many years of enjoyment out of this desk. I'm Chris DeHut for Woodworking at Home magazine. Thanks for watching.
I sincerely hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you truly enjoyed it, please help us share this information with the rest of the communities. Please hit the subscribe button, give us a big thumbs up, and be sure to tell your friends about this channel. Thanks again for watching.